So welcome everybody to the RCS Ruminant Nutrition Coaching webinar today. This has been brought to you by the Federal Government's Future Drought Fund as part of our delivery of a project called Soils and Landscapes. In that Soils and Landscapes project, we have 24 businesses throughout southern Queensland and northern New South Wales who are working with RCS and My Grazing to improve their drought management. And that's through concentrating on matching stocking rate to carrying capacity. So I'm really pleased to bring Dr. Terry McCosker on today to help acknowledge the fact that ruminant nutrition also plays an important part in our drought resilience on our properties. So I'm excited to say good day to Terry and welcome you all to this ruminant nutrition webinar. And I hope you've brought plenty of questions with you because it's an interactive coaching session. And so we have Terry in the room to be able to answer those questions. And he'll actually start off with a bit of knowledge, and then we'll be able to ask our questions. Now, for those who haven't been on Zoom before, you have the ability to turn your camera on and turn your audio on when you're ready to have a chat, or you're welcome to be a little bit silent in the background and use the chat function in the Zoom bottom prompts down the bottom to ask questions, and we'll keep an eye on those questions if you are typing them in. So let's get started, and welcome Terry McCosker.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everybody, COVID or not. As Joe said, I really want to make this an interactive session. I don't really know, what you'd like to know, so I could rabbit on here all afternoon and not cover what was necessary for you. So what I thought I'd do to begin with is just give a very brief overview of the basic principles of nutrition, see what questions we have, and then I've got bits of presentations that I can do on things like energy and protein and minerals and economics, etc. That I'll then use the slides as a way to try and help answer some of the questions so that there's a bit of visual that goes with the answers. So as you can see, cattle are really only interested in 4 food groups. So let's just look into this. So water is actually 10% of body weight. Intake should be about 10% of body weight. Water per se is about 80% of body weight. So water is a very, very important nutrient. And I'll spend a little bit of time on it because, through the presentation tonight, because it is so important. And often we overlook it as a nutrient, and particularly in droughts, because our water quality can go off. And water quantity can become limited, so it's something we need to keep an eye on. Energy, though, is by far and away the greatest thing that we all, ourselves and our animals need to consume every day. And around about 85–90% of what we actually digest needs to be energy. So that sort of puts it in context. It's a really, really critical part of our diet. And obviously for animals, that energy is coming straight out of grass or forage or legumes or whatever they're eating. But and they have the ability to access that, where we as mere humans don't have the ability to access energy out of grass. Protein, 8–15% of dry matter intake is what our animals, just the range at which animals will perform pretty well. 8% is generally considered the cutoff. Once you go below 8%, animals will actually start losing weight as a component of their body weight. And then you've got the macro minerals. These are things like phosphorus, calcium, sulfur, potassium, but generally very rare for that to be a deficiency. Magnesium is one of the macros. that can often be quite important. And then we have the micro minerals. They're things like zinc, copper, selenium, cobalt, manganese. They're sort of probably the main micro minerals that we would be interested in. And our macro minerals are required in grams per day, and the micro minerals are required in micrograms per day. And that's essentially the difference between them. But they're all critical for animal performance. And then we've got the vitamins A, B, C, D, and E. Vitamin deficiencies in livestock are extremely rare. I have seen a vitamin A deficiency twice in my life, and vitamin A deficiencies in livestock can be created from during a drought, in fact. So if an animal doesn't see any green feed for at least a year, then there's a possibility it can become vitamin A deficient. And while I'm on that, I might as well talk about it, because what vitamin A deficiency creates in your animal is a thing called night blindness. So your animal will actually go down, it will sit, it will look fairly healthy, but it can't actually see. And the best way to diagnose it is you just creep up on the animal and then just flick your hand in front of its eyes, and if it doesn't blink, well, you know it's got night blindness. And you could actually hit it with an injection of vitamin A, and it'll be up and about in a few hours. But the rest of the vitamins, so the B group, the C group, and the E group in particular, they come from enzymes created by the rumen bugs. So provided you've got a healthy rumen, you're not going to have a B, a D, or an E vitamin, sorry, B, C, or E vitamin deficiency. D is exactly like you and I. It comes from sunlight. So we shouldn't actually have a vitamin D deficiency in grazing animals. Those are the 6 primary groups of nutrition. And, in maybe perhaps in answering your questions, we might go through those in a little more depth. Principles of nutrition. Firstly, water is a critical nutrient, and we often forget that. And sometimes because we don't actually measure water intakes, we don't know how critical it is, or we don't know if we have a water deficiency. But we can talk a bit more about that, but it's certainly one that we need to keep an eye on. Production needs adequate energy availability. Now, the word availability there is quite critical in that sentence, because often we have a heap of standing energy in the paddock that's unavailable to the livestock. So they could be standing belly deep in grass and dying of starvation. So we can talk a little bit about that. And I suspect that in areas that have had a good season over the last year or two, that's going to be something you're going to be coming either into this winter or already into it, where you've actually got a lot of standing forage, but animals are not necessarily performing. That means they have an energy deficiency. We don't fix that by feeding energy, which takes a bit of getting your head around. The third principle is that the rumen bug population determines feed intake and protein. So the protein that your animals digest comes from rumen bugs. So as those bugs die, they live and they die, and they live for about 20 minutes. And as they die, they pass through the rumen, and they're the perfect form of protein for a ruminant. So they're absorbed in the fourth stomach, and then that's where your ruminant actually gets its protein from. So it's really critical to understand that a ruminant animal will get no energy and no protein that does not first go through the rumen bugs and is processed by the rumen bug. And that's why the rumen bug population is very critical to animal performance. We've got to balance minerals for optimal production, whether they be macros or micros. Often I see people feeding the wrong things at the wrong time, or sometimes the wrong things at the right time, or the right things at the wrong time. There's a lot where you can waste a lot of money and create a lot of very expensive urine and dung by feeding the wrong things. And finally, we've got to make sure that any supplementary feeding that we're doing is profitable. So now there's two sorts of feeding that we can do to an animal. There is supplementary feeding and there is substitute feeding. So substitute feeding would be if you were feeding hay, grain, silage, even lots of molasses, where you're substituting for energy that should be available in the paddock. Supplementary feeding is where you're supplementing for a mineral or protein or something that's required in very small quantities that can catalyse performance within the animal. So we don't want to do substitute feeding because that will send you broke. Whereas what we want to focus on is supplementary feeding. But we've got to make sure that even when we're supplementing, it's got to be profitable. So I might just pull up there and see what questions we have. I can see there's no more in the chat room, but does anybody who wants to put the hand up and ask a question or two on anything you've seen there at the moment that piques your interest or creates a question?
If someone is trying to ask a question, you are all on mute. I can see Lucas, you're coming off mute.
Yeah, Lucas here. How are you, Terry?
Yeah, g'day, Lucas. How come I'm not surprised you're here tonight?
Yeah, the big surprise. Hey, mate, you mentioned night blindness. I've heard of, whether it's the same, night blindness or mentioned in that form on brassicas, feeding a diet that's basically too much brassica in it for, I think they were yearlings or something on there, and they were mentioned that they were suffering night blindness.
Right. I don't know whether that's got any relation to vitamin A or not. I doubt it, because if you're feeding a brassica, you're going to be feeding a lot of green material and therefore you're getting a lot of keratin, and it's the keratin that's turned into vitamin A in the liver. And the liver can actually store vitamin A for up to about a year, which is why it takes a year for you to run into trouble without any green feed. Yeah, that sounds to me like it's due to something else that's in the brassicas, Lucas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what you would do about it. It's obviously an excess. Yeah, less of them. Yeah, it's an excess of something, isn't it?
Yeah, so you balance the minerals, so it might be causing an imbalance there that may, for argument's sake, prevents the uptake of vitamin A. I don't
know. That's a possibility. One of the things that does that is actually zinc deficiency can prevent the liver storing vitamin A. I would suspect with brassicas, you're really looking at a nitrate or a nitrite toxicity.
Yeah.
And you really should balance that out with roughage. Much more roughage in the diet. And if you don't have it in the pasture, then you probably would want to feed, poor quality hay or something like that.
Yeah.
See, there's something in the chat there now.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So Jody Sams asks, and it's a great question because I think it's pretty much equivalent to a human health question. Jody is asking if the rumen bug population is compromised by, for example, acidosis, how can you help grow or increase the population again?
Yeah, so what the bug population does, it adjusts itself depending on the pH of the rumen. So you've got two types of bugs in the rumen, what we call pink bugs and blue bugs, basically. Now, pink bugs survive in an acid rumen, and when you put grain into the rumen, that grain is basically broken down into acids, which turns your rumen acidic fairly quickly, basically lactic acid. And what that does is lowers the pH in the rumen very, very quickly. If you do that too quickly, it doesn't give time for the pink bugs or the technical term is amylolytic digesters. They're the starch digesters in the rumen. If you go on a grain too quickly, it doesn't give them time to build up. But that quickly lowering pH kills off the bugs that are going to consume or handle your cellulose, your cellulolytic digesters. So introducing animals to grain, which is the main thing that's going to create acidosis in the rumen, it needs to be done quite slowly to give the rumen time to adjust. So if you think about an animal coming off grass, it's 100% virtually of cellulitic digesters. So you feed a half a kilo of grain a day, and that then starts to allow the rumen to adjust to that much grain and that much acidity. So you'll have some cellulitic digesters will come down and the amylolytic digesters will increase in population, and then they'll stay adjusted to that while you're at that, say, or half a kilo of grain a day. And then as you add more grain over time, then you are reducing the cellulolytic digesters and increasing the amylolytic digesters. And so you shouldn't run into a problem with acidosis. I don't know whether that answers the question or not.
Maybe the second part would be if you have reduced it completely, is there, or what could be done to bring that back up rather than just preventing it?
Well, again, it's if you've got acidosis, it's really created by making too big a change in the rumen in the feed too quickly. So to grow the population, you basically give it time. So if you were on, say, a diet where you're feeding a couple of kilograms of grain a day while they're in the paddock, for example, the rumen will actually adjust to that, and the bugs can handle both the feeds that you're feeding them. So it generally is going to be time to allow that to fix itself.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks for that.
Answer there from Kath. Assume that's on the.
Kath's asking, yeah. I think, Kath's making a statement, sorry. I think that it's from the, I'm not even going to pronounce that word, Terry. You'd probably be an expert at pronouncing that particular word. People on this call probably know how I pronounce words, not related to the vitamin A.
Yeah, that's right. I couldn't see how it could be there. Thanks for that, Kath.
So Darren and Kim Cousins, they're asking, what is the best test to find out what you're lacking in the dung or the bloods?
That's a really good question. Often dung and bloods are not a good way of testing. Dung can be a good way of testing phosphorus deficiency, but you can really only test that when your animals are about half a quality diet. So in other words, you can't test it when they're on really good quality feed, and you can't test it when they're on poor quality feed. And the reason for that is that when they're on good quality feed, they're actually storing phosphorus. So it's circulating in the blood to get to the bone. And if they're on really poor quality feed, they can be taking it out again and it's circulating in the blood to get to the animal coming from the bone. So there's only a brief window. And generally, say in Queensland conditions, you'd be looking at, February, March or April as being the opportune times to test for phosphorus. I find the best way to diagnose deficiencies is actually using free choice minerals, but free choice minerals where you've actually got a big range of minerals. And what you'll find is that the animals will take different things in different paddocks, in different seasons, in different physiology. So they might take something when they're lactating and not take it when they're dry. Different parts of your property, they'll take different things. The animals have what's called nutritional wisdom, and they have an incredible level of nutritional wisdom. And so I would really find the best way that I've found for diagnosing most minerals is actually put out a smorgasbord and they will tell you what they need. But don't rely on what they eat this week. Put that smorgasbord out and leave it out over a long period of time. And then you'll learn. And then some deficiencies they'll actually correct and won't go back to that thing again. And anything that's excess to their requirements will go out of them in the blood and in the dung and the urine. And so you can test, I think I mentioned testing phosphorus in the dung. You can test protein in the dung and get an indication of digestibility also with a dung sample. All right.
Then Jodie's also added to that particular question about hair testing.
Yeah, righto. Yeah, so Beck, you're actually right about taking 2 weeks for the ruminants to generally adjust. Let me dig down a bit through these. I can't see the one about, what was that one you just mentioned, Joe?
Jodie was just adding to Darren and Kim's question about the dung and blood testing. She's asking, what about hair testing?
Hair testing? It's not something I've used. I think that there's probably some minerals that it might give you an indication with, and copper could be one of those. But I don't think there's any better diagnostic tool than the animal itself. And I think you can get, my experience over a long period of time is that you can probably get led up a garden path by looking at samples at one point in time, at one place from an animal, out of one animal, that sort of stuff. The variability across a herd or a flock is actually substantial. All right. How are we going? Any other questions here, Joe?
No, not yet. If there's any other questions that people might want to take themselves off mute and ask directly or pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we might move on to the...
Well, I might just progress on a little bit and talk a bit about water, and then we can stop the questions again at the end of that. And if you've got questions through that process, drop them in the chat. Nice.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion so far. Thank you.
There we go. Water. Water, as we said earlier, is a critical nutrient. It affects the what's happening in the blood and the osmotic pressure, which it determines material moving between the bloodstream and the cells. Temperature regulator, obviously, it transports nutrients around the body. very key component of saliva and milk. And it's obviously used to eliminate waste from the body, so it has a lot of functions. Saliva is one worth talking about. If we took a, say, 450 kilogram animal at 30 degrees centigrade, it's probably should be drinking about 40, 45 litres of water a day. That same animal is probably drinking somewhere between 40 and 60 and maybe up to 80 litres of saliva a day. A dairy cow, for example, will be drinking around 180 litres of saliva a day. So generally, the amount of saliva, particularly cattle, drink significantly exceeds the amount of water that they drink. So there's a continuous process of fluid going into the rumen. If we look at, say, here, we'll just look at some on this graph here, lactating cows. So the numbers along the bottom of this graph is temperature in degrees centigrade. At the left-hand side is litres of water per head per day. Now you can see if we take 5 degrees centigrade, a dry cow probably needs about 20 litres, a bit over 20 litres of water a day. That same cow lactating probably needs to drink nearly double that. And you can see all the way through the lactating cow requires a lot more water, and that's to do with the milk production. And also the feed intake, her feed intake will increase as well. So at 30 degrees, that dry cow probably could be drinking 50 litres, and the wet cow 70 litres. Now I've seen cattle in heat waves drinking 100 litres of water a day. And that would last for 2 or 3 days. So that's the kind of water intakes that we need to make sure that we've actually allowed for. If you look at growing animals, again, they're a bit less. So at 5 degrees centigrade, you're looking at, say, 20 litres for a 270 kilogram animal, and maybe 35 litres a day for a 450 kilogram animal. And again, you'll see that because of the size of the animal, the amount of water increases, and so does it increase as the temperature rises. So the reason that a 450 kilogram animal is requiring more water is that it's essentially eating more feed. And there's a very close correlation between water intake and feed intake. So if your water intake is low, and that could be depressing your feed intake, then you're actually lowering animal production because you simply don't have enough water for the animals to drink. And with sheep, if we're looking at, say, singles there versus twins, we'll look at, say, late pregnancy. A ewe there is requiring, with she singles, about 6 litres of water a day and up to 10 litres of water a day. And if she's not twins, and again, just that's to do with milk production. And then as they dry off, they come down to fairly low water intakes. So one of the things that affects water intake, did you want me to pull up there, Joe?
Yeah, Terry, I wasn't sure of this next slide, but you might be going into what I was going to ask. In bringing it back into a drought situation, if ground cover is lacking, temperatures higher, how would that correlate to the water intake of the animal?
It will increase water intake, as will lack of shade.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got bare ground, then the radiative heat is actually, much more significant than if you've got good ground cover. So yeah, I would suspect that that's going to increase water intake. Now, often what you find in those situations is really poor quality water drying up in dams or creeks, etc. Sometimes water levels in bores are going down. Your water quality can be going backwards because the water volume is lower out of a bore. So there's some real issues that can occur in a drought with water intake. Here you can see a trough, and the trough on the right-hand side is the exact same trough. We were getting 8 litres of water a day on fully grown cattle, which is around about a quarter, a third to a quarter of what those animals should be drinking per day. So in this particular instance, we put magnets on the water, and the intake went to 24 litres a day. And you'll notice that the water has cleaned up. The calcium on the float valves has gone, but that water now is crystal clear. And I think one of the things you could ask yourself is, would I drink that? And, I would drink out of the trough on the right, but I wouldn't be too keen to drink out of the one on the left. And I think that it applies to your animals as well. And I think one of the things we probably don't do well enough is actually measure water intakes. And everywhere we've measured it, I would say 70 to 80% of the time we've found a problem. The problem with this trough here and this system is actually biology that's building up in the pipes and in the water. Now, what the magnet has done, it creates an electrical charge in the water, which has removed that biology from the inside of the pipes and also from the troughs. And then the water intake goes up. So it's really simple stuff, but very important for animal production. The magnets don't work for everything. They're not a magic solution for everything, but they certainly work for biological solutions. And a lot of, I suppose there's 2 situations in which they'll work. So if you look down the left-hand corner of that slide, you'll see calcium build up in those pipes. The time to put a magnet on is before the calcium starts to build up in your pipe, because it will prevent it. So if you're putting in a new water system and you're finding that calcium is building up, then get some magnets into that system pretty quickly. If you're like the pipe on the extreme left there and it's already half filled with calcium by the time you put the magnets on, then look out, because your pipes can clog up, your float valves will certainly clog up, and you're going to have a real problem. So if you've got a big calcium build-up, basically what you've got to do is open up the line at the bottom, go to the top end and flush it out with an acid, and you'll get a massive build-up and flush out of calcium at the other end, and then the magnets will help keep that clean. The other thing that magnets will do is clean out the inside of your pipe. So if you break a pipe or you pull one apart and have a look inside, and run your finger around the inside of that pipe, what you'll find most of the time is either a black slime or a red slime. That slime is living bacteria. And where you've got living bacteria, you've got a lot more dead ones than you've got live ones. So those bacteria are dying and ending up in the trough, and animals can taste that. So that's one of the reasons why you see that sort of change we've seen there in water intakes. So I think water is a very critical nutrient and something we probably need to be monitoring and measuring. I'll pull up there to see if there's any questions that don't necessarily have to be about water, but was there anything coming to the chat room then?
Not yet. I'm wondering if it's a good opportunity for people to share their water stories. Like, what experiences have you had? Either great water stories or lessons that you've learnt so far that might save others from learning those same lessons.
Good question, Joe. Anybody game to stick their hand up on that one?
Yeah, Lucas.
Just with our bore at home, I actually contacted Filter Systems Australia, and they suggested, like, I don't know, might have been 5 or 6 magnets to go on the system. I guess that's their recommendation. And that ends up a fair old cost. It puts it up with sort of where other systems are to do that. Like our cattle are drinking it. Should we just try one magnet and see if that makes a difference?
That's what I would do. So I would start with a magnet on the outlet from your highest point. See what changes that brings about in the troughs below you. The impact of a magnet can last for anywhere from sort of 1.5 to about 5 or so Ks. And so, you know, if it's in storage though, the effect doesn't last that long. So in a tank, you know, that to put water in a tank through a magnet, for example, then the impact of that magnet can probably disappear within about 4 or 5 days. So I would start with one. So that one there on the left, that is one of their magnets. It's a particular type of magnet, an earth magnet. And I found them pretty good. You can buy those other really big ones, you know, they cost $3,000, $5,000 each or something. They found them probably, overkill where I've seen them. But yeah, I'd start with one and then just follow it down the line and see how that looks.
Certainly our water, if it'll sit in the trough for any period of time, like we'll get blue-green algae that will grow in there. We do get some scaling around the edge of the trough there as well, but we certainly haven't had any scaling in pipes or anything like that. So we clean those troughs, like when they go to those paddocks where the troughs are, we certainly broom those troughs back out again each time. So it's as clean as it possibly can. So
I'd give one a go and just see what you think.
Yep.
And the size of the magnet does depend on the size of your pipe and the flow rate you're using. So, you know, that one on that pipe there, that's only a 1-inch pipe. That's quite a small magnet. Where if you're whacking a magnet on a 75mm pipe, then it's going to be a much bigger magnet, much more expensive. All right. Anybody else got a story there to share?
Yeah, it's Jeff here. Hi, guys. Just a quick one. One of the things that I found over the last couple of years when we were doing some work with guys with containment feeding systems is what they were doing was utilising flowing water. So they'd have a secondary pump or they'd have a pumping system that would allow the water to keep moving. And mainly in the sheep job we were working on these ones, we found that there was a lot of increase when it came to intake because the water was clear and clean and moving more. So when the water created a dust film or there was a dust film on top of the water, what we found was that the intake was reduced. But once that water lost that dust on top, it actually increased the intake a bit there. So as little as a bubbler system of some sort in some of these troughs, again, in a containment feeding type system, that tended to give us a fair increase in that case. And the consumption went up and the quality of the water went up as well in that case.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And I think one of the things that can be happening there as well is cooling the water. When you're keeping it moving, often when it heats up in the trough, and that'll also impact on the water intake.
Yep, that was the other thing as well. The temperature of the water was quite critical in that as well.
Yeah. But yeah, certainly sheep or young calves, anything like that you're feeding, then the cleanliness of that water is absolutely critical. And yeah, any form of dust is not good for it. Good point. Thanks, Jeff.
All right.
Righto. We'll roll on for a bit then. Principle number 2, production needs adequate energy availability. This is the biggest nutrient of all, and basically it comes from sunlight. So we've got the photosynthetic equation: CO2, water, chlorophyll, and sun producing carbohydrates and releasing oxygen and water. So what are some of the carbohydrates that plants actually produce? So they produce sugars, and that's the first thing that most plants actually produce as a result of photosynthesis, and they produce what are called simple sugars. And then the plant, as it gets older or does more with it, what's called complexing those sugars and turns them into different products. So if you were feeding sugar to an animal, you'd probably be feeding it molasses. One of the other carbohydrates that plants produce is starch. And if you were feeding starch, you'd be feeding a grain, essentially. And that's the one that can impact the rumen pH. Cellulose comes from any form of forage, basically grasses, legumes. Even if they're grazing trees, they're consuming cellulose, and it's the energy released from that cellulose that's is producing the energy. Oils essentially come from meals, so things like cottonseed meal, copra meal, sunflower meal, canola meal. Any of the meals basically have been heat treated to remove the protein or the oils from them, whichever way it was. Generally, the removing oil. There's oil left, but they end up as protein meals, and so there's oil in there. Oil is a very dense form of energy. And the last one is lignin, which is wood, and that's the one you don't actually want in your diet. So those are basically the sort of forms of energy that animals can be exposed to. And if we look at it in terms of the sigmoid curve, so you've got your quality and quantity. So as your quantity goes up and time goes out and stretches out, you'll end up with lower quality over time. And obviously the sweet spot somewhere there in the middle around the upper part of phase 2, where you're going to optimise quality and quantity. That does depend a bit on the time of the year. Probably the most important thing to understand about energy is this thing called digestibility. And it's an index of the ease with which bugs can break down energy. So if we had a digestibility of 0, that means that, and we fed a kilo of feed to an animal that had a digestibility of 0, it could be full of energy, but the ruminant would extract no energy from it, or the bugs would extract no energy from it. If we had a digestibility of 50%, then the bugs can access 50% of the energy that's in that feed. And 50% is basically break even. So anything less than 50%, your animal is going to be going backwards because it then can't get enough energy out of the feed that it's eating. So as it's called dry matter digestibility, as dry matter digestibility goes down, consumption goes down with it. So C3 grasses, for example, some of the ones in Western New South Wales might be C3s. Basically, Northern New South Wales, Queensland, we're working off C4s. They can have quite high dry matter digestibility. So when I'm talking a C3, I might be talking something like, a ryegrass, a phalaris, cocksfoot, fescue, etc. And even some of the native grasses, temperate grasses are C3s. So they have high digestibility. Now, our C4s if we're working in the tropics and subtropics, we have lower dry matter digestibility in C4s. That's basically because of the way they handle photosynthesis. So they're designed for high sunlight intensity compared to the C3s, and therefore they process sunlight in a different way, which is not good for animal production, basically. So to sort of show a bit of a link between animal performance and digestibility, if we had a digestibility of greater than 60% in a feed, those animals should, all else being equal, should be able to grow it, and I'm talking cattle, at 1 to 1.5 kilograms per head per day. If that digestibility was 55 to 60%, then that growth rate drops back to 0.5 to 1. And then you drop it back to 50 to 55% digestibility, and then you're at break even, up to half a kilo a day. And then as you go below 50%, then the rate of loss increases. But the interesting thing about those numbers is that 1 percentage point change in digestibility equals 100 grams a day in growth rate. So keeping your digestibility up is absolutely critical for average daily gain. And it's difficult to control, and we can never determine where it ends up fully, but we can influence it. And we can influence it basically with grazing. So by grazing and resting in the growing season, grazing and resting, by the time we get to our non-growing season, the average age of the leaf is younger, and we will therefore have higher digestibility in that leaf and better animal performance. So we need high digestibility to have high intakes to get high animal performance. So if we look at energy overall, so if we took a kilo of old speargrass, for example, and dried it out to a dry kilo of old speargrass, and we took a kilo of a really nice oats crop and got a dry kilo of it, there is actually no difference in the total or gross energy available in those 2 kilos. But there'd obviously be a very big difference in the performance of the animals on each of those 2 feeds. So that amount of energy in the plant to begin with is what's called gross energy. And if it can't be digested by the bugs, that energy is lost in the feces. And this is where then digestibility comes in. So the bugs are able to digest some of that feed. So if it was oats, it's high digestibility. So the bugs might access 80% of the energy that's in oats and only 45% of the energy that's in old speargrass. And that's where digestibility plays a significant role. Now, while the bugs are digesting that energy, they are emitting methane and also losing some energy in the urine. But what's left is what's called metabolizable energy. That is the energy that actually goes to your animal for production. Now, the first part of metabolizable energy goes into heat production. So it takes a lot more energy to get warm on a cold day than it does to get cool on a hot day. So middle of winter, your animal's energy requirements have gone up. Middle of winter, with cloud cover and a lot of wind, your actual temperature is low and the energy requirement's gone up. So what's left after maintaining body temperature is what's called net energy. Net energy goes into 2 places. Firstly, it goes into maintenance, and that is maintenance of body weight and bodily function. If you've got enough energy left over after maintenance, then it goes into production. So if we took that oats crop, for example, 80% digestibility. We're only losing 20% of the energy in the feces. Metabolisable energy is about 82% of digestible. We use energy for heat, but we've got a lot of energy left over and we're going to get production. But we feed that animal spear grass and we get all the way down to the bottom and we don't even have enough energy for maintenance and your animal is going backwards. So basically with our country or our grasses, lignin goes up and absolutely everything else comes down. As lignin goes up, digestibility comes down, rate of passage through the rumen comes down, therefore intake comes down, therefore net energy into the animal comes down, then production comes down and gross margin comes down. So your public enemy number one as a grazier is lignification. So I might just pull up there, Joe.
Yeah, Terry, there's no questions so far. However, this is a big topic. It's a lot to get through right now. So I'm wondering if people have some experience here of what they've seen, you know, when you've got lignified grass versus fresh green. A lot of people around that, or at least in the project for Soils and Landscape, have had a good season in the last 12 months. Oh, not so much 12 months, but the summer and autumn, they've had some good green grass. What does that look like in terms of what you're seeing for the digestibility?
Yeah, I think before we get into that topic, I think I'd go into protein because these two are linked, energy and protein. So I'll deal with the protein, then I think we can deal with your questions and that issue you just raised, because it'll make more sense then.
Oh, yeah, cool.
Right.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's no question so far, at least, Terry.
Right, yeah, thanks, Joe. Right, so the rumen bug populations determine feed intake and protein available to your animal. Now, there's millions and billions of bugs in the rumen. In fact, there's billions per mil of rumen fluid. So there's a lot of these guys in there. So there's your blue bugs that operate, you know, from 6.2 to about 7 pH, and then you've got your pink bugs, which are your amylolytic digesters that operate from about 5.4 to 6.2. And we've already talked a little bit about, you know, adjusting the rumen, and you've got to allow each of those populations to adjust if you start adding grain into the rumen. Incidentally, if you're feeding molasses, it doesn't have the same impact on the rumen that grain will have. Now, there's not just bacteria in the rumen, there's fungi and protozoa. There's just a very broad range of microorganisms in the rumen. And in a past life, I had the privilege of actually working on ruminant microorganisms. Yeah, that's a fascinating space. So, so basically 1 mil of rumen fluid can contain 10 to the 8, that's 1 billion rumen microbes per mil, all right? That's a lot of bugs. The average lifespan of a microbe is about 20 minutes. Average size of a rumen is 60 litres for cattle and 15 litres for sheep. So if you start thinking about how many bugs actually there are in the rumen, the numbers are enormous. And there's some numbers at the bottom there. I don't expect you to remember those. And there won't be an exam at the end that, you know, sees whether you can remember how many noughts to put on the end of the number of bugs that are there in a day. But the reason I put those numbers in there is just to illustrate to you that the bug turnover and the number of bugs is enormous. But that's critical to the health of the animal. And the higher that turnover, the better the animal's actually doing. The more bugs that are there, the better it's doing. The thing that determines that rumen bug population is actually the rumen ammonia level. So as the rumen ammonia, so if we had 10 to the 8 bugs, 1 billion bugs per mil of rumen fluid, we would have quite a high rumen ammonia level. Now, if we started feeding a feed that is low in protein, and that might be happening to some of you now. You might be, browned off, protein's dropped out. You're feeding basically grasses that grew a while ago. Now, what will be happening is that your rumen bug population will have dropped substantially, and you can have lost up to 999 million bugs per mil of rumen fluid as the rumen ammonia level drops. All right, so were there any questions so far?
None in the chat yet. Everyone must be pretty clued up on their little critters.
Oh yeah, this is fantastic. Right, so let's go back to your question now, Joe, of if you've got a lot of dry feed, what are you actually going to do?
Yeah, so I'm not sure everyone's situation here, but just to give some context, in the Soils and Landscape project, we're all about becoming more drought resilient, so being able to handle any season, and we're all graziers, so there's cattle, sheep, goat farmers in amongst the 24 businesses, and we saw that dry come in last year, mid-year. Some people running grazing charts were able to start seeing that quite early, though it hit around that probably sort of May, July time, and people didn't start to see rain until December, and then got great rain. A lot of people got really good, got under good showers, that late summer, then through autumn, which was good to see. So I'm wondering, I guess, how does that impact the nutrition intake of the animals that these guys are running, and how do we do that better next time?
First thing I think to take into account is, especially with C4 grasses, that generally from about 10 weeks after your first rain, the protein starts to drop in a grass. Now, if you've got legume in your pasture, then the animal will start at about that 10, 11 week mark to eat more legume, because the protein's starting to drop in the grass. If you've got top feed, for example, that's better in protein, and generally a lot of it is, then the animals will actually start to eat more top feed or tree leaves. And that's to make up for the lowering rumen ammonia level. So the animal knows what its rumen ammonia level is at any point in time. And it knows that by monitoring its saliva. So as the protein in that grass drops, the bug population starts to drop. You won't notice it in animal performance initially, but you will be losing animal performance well before you can see it. For me, one of the things to do is to actually prevent any loss of performance or weight or condition before you see it happening. The way to do that is to actually start some protein supplementation early. And often your plants can still be green, but with reducing protein. So even though they're green, if there wasn't much legume in the system, then the animals would probably start taking some protein supplement. So start something very early on a very small rate and stop the decline in the animals before it happens. And then they will tell you, they'll eat very, very small amounts initially, and then gradually, as that quality declines further and further and further, they'll start to want to eat more and more of a protein supplement.
And that's through one way of getting that small supplement, or the self-feeding supplement, is through that free choice application.
No, because what you're wanting to feed here is a macronutrient. So you only feed free choice with minerals. Your deficiency here, you've got two deficiencies.
Protein.
You've got well, you've actually got an energy deficiency, which is what's creating the lack of growth or the loss of condition, but it's being created by a protein deficiency. So what happens is if we fed protein to that animal, or it had adequate legume, for example, its bug population would stay up, and it would therefore be able to process enough protein every day, enough energy every day, I should say, because it's the bugs that also process the energy. So if we don't have the bug population, we're losing energy and protein. So for an animal, low protein is a double whammy because it's missing protein and it's losing energy because it doesn't have the bug population.
And then clean water to bolster that.
Yeah, so clean water. So what you would be doing is something like that situation is feed something like a urea supplement, which is the cheapest way to get energy, protein into an animal on a daily basis. Now, if you start early, they might only eat, 5 or 10 grams a day of urea. But over the next 3 months, that might increase to 30, 40 grams a day. So that's the sort of the way to go about. Firstly, it's a diagnostic tool because if they don't need it, they won't eat it. And then secondly, if you get it out early, then you haven't lost condition before you go and start doing something. The risk you run with things like urea is that if you let the condition of the animal drop, then the bug population is already very, very low before you start to do anything. The animal at that stage is craving protein. So if you put any form of protein out there, urea it's actually not a protein, but it creates protein for the animal. And so the animal will crave that, will eat far more than it can actually handle. And because you don't have the bug population that consumes that urea and converts it into ammonia, the urea can go straight across and pass into the bloodstream, and then you've got a problem. Or it just gets excess ammonia, and there's not enough bugs to consume the ammonia that you've just created in the room, which is more likely what will happen. So getting that urea out early actually maintains the bug population. So any threat from that urea is actually not there because you've now got a very high bug population, and firstly, they won't eat much of it, but secondly, even if they did, they've got a very high ruminant ammonia level and they can handle it.
Yeah. And lowering that bug population takes that time again to bring it back up. So time's not on your side.
Yeah.
Thanks, Terry. We do have a question in the chat from Jody. In terms of supplement feeding, has anyone had experience with growing fodder in a fodder machine? And how does soaking and growing grain for 3 days, for example, barley, change the protein in the grain? So there's 2 questions there, maybe addressing the first one. Any experience with growing fodder in a fodder machine?
I'd like to see if there's anyone with experience before I answer that one.
Lucas?
I've formulated a few rations with people feeding on the fodder machines, and you need a little bit more than just the stuff you're growing in the fodder machine.
So a fodder machine, you're saying, is a good supplement, but not the only feed regime.
Still another input. So when you look at diets, Terry will explain it more, but we need a dry matter requirement for the animal, depending on what we're trying to push for production, but it might be 2% of the body weight of that animal or 2.5% of the body weight of that animal. So then in a fodder machine, we're feeding something Terry touched on before, like in oats, we're at 85% moisture, so only 15% dry matter. So then we have to basically, it could be 65 kilos of stuff has to come out of that fodder machine to meet the daily dry matter requirements of that animal.
Yeah, I've been seeing these things for probably 35 years, and I don't see too many of them that last very long. People tend to get sick of it because it's very intensive. You spend most of your time putting grain into the fodder machine, making sure it's working, and then pulling stuff out of the other end of the fodder machine and carting it out to the paddocks. And that'll take up a fair bit of your day. There's no doubt the concept is viable as a concept. If you only had green feed, only had brown feed, and supplied a little bit of that every day, there's some impact on the rumen by putting in green material into the rumen. It affects the bug population. I don't know what that impact is, but there's a bit of magic in it. So the principle of the fodder machine and the concept of them is theoretically sound. I don't believe it's economically sound. And you're going to become a slave to the fodder machine if you try and go down that track. And as a drought strategy, if it was for mine, I wouldn't be doing it.
So, Jody, may I ask why you might be considering that? Is there a problem you're solving, or you're just looking for options, or what would be the reason for you thinking about that? I know you're typing these in, so I'll give you some time. And while you're thinking of that, we might go on to Jody's second question. How does soaking and growing grain for 3 days change the protein in the grain?
Yeah, I did know the answer to this question, Jody, but I can't recall it off the top of my head right now. But what you're effectively doing is you're converting stuff from starch into cellulose and into protein. So those young shoots are very high in protein. And there's still a little bit of starch in there, but effectively you're converting it across. By germinating it, you're converting starch into cellulose. And you've got a rumen that's requiring the cellulose. And so it doesn't have the same impact as feeding grain because you've germinated.
Okay, we don't have Jody answering the additional question, so I might move on to Angus. Sorry, Jody has just answered. So she's having plenty of dried off feed but lacking protein. So that was, she's looking at that. Yeah.
You see that mean green machine in front of you on the screen, Jody? Make a couple of those, hook them up to something like that is there, and start feeding something like the McCosker brew. It's the cheapest thing that you can actually do, because what you're doing when you're feeding something like that is you're catalyzing the rumen. So you're feeding let's say you're feeding 100 grams of supplement a day, which might contain 30 grams of urea. That 30 grams of urea might be increasing dry matter intake by 1 to 2 kilos a day. So for what's effectively a small investment into feeding the bugs, you increase the bug population, they're able to consume more grass, they're therefore able to release more energy to the animal. And also, because they're dying, they'll also produce more protein, more microbial protein. So that's effectively what we're trying to do is catalyse what you're doing and catalyse the rumen to perform a lot better.
Awesome. Angus's question: how is urea best introduced in the first place how is urea best introduced in the first place to cattle that are poor and likely to be protein deficient?
So the first rule of thumb, Angus, is early while you've got something green. And if that's not economic or not worth it, without knowing your location, it's hard for me to be more specific with that. So whereabouts are you, Angus?
Let's see if I can answer that for Angus. He hasn't typed it in yet.
So there's really sort of probably 3 times at which you'd start something like this. The first and the best one, and particularly with lactating animals, is early. So what you do is you maintain the lactation instead of it dropping off. You maintain cow body condition score or ewe body condition score. You also delay weaning, so you end up with a bigger weaner. So that's the first thing. If we don't get it going then at what you might class as the beginning of your dry season, or a time when you actually see a bit of weight loss or something like that, or a bit of condition drop, then get it out then. By that stage, you've already lost something, but the craving probably won't be all that high. And you can often, at that time of the year, start off a supplement at 30% because it's not palatable. So they'll gradually get onto it and then they'll be pretty right. The third scenario is when you start it very late. The animal has lost a fair amount of condition. They're craving protein, and this is where you've got to be really careful about how you introduce it. So now you introduce it with a low percentage. You give them, if it's cattle, you give them 2 weeks to adjust. If it's sheep, you give them at least 3 weeks to adjust to, say, a low percentage. Then you go up. Say if it was cattle, you'd go from, say, 10% to 20% for another 2 weeks. Then you might go from 20% to 30%, in another 2 weeks. So you've got to bring it up slowly. And what you're doing there is you're actually building the bug population so they can handle more and more urea. So you're building the bug population slowly. If it's sheep, then you start them off at about 5%. You go to 10, and then you go to 15, and you stop. So with sheep, we don't go above 15% in a supplement. I would only feed a supplement to older animals. I wouldn't feed these sort of supplements to lambs, for example. Goats, you've got to be very careful with your ear. That's not something you can really play with goats. So I'd probably keep it away from goats. All right, so where are we? How are we going, Joe?
So we're just about 10 to 6, Terry.
Oh, right.
So yeah, we've gone an extensive period of time. What would you like to do? One more question, or do a wrap up of what you're wanting to summarise?
Is there any significant questions left in the chat, or was there any
No, Angus did mention that he's from Southern Rangelands of the WA. So,
right.
But no further questions at the moment.
Yeah, so some of what I was saying there, Angus, is not as applicable to you because you've actually got top feed. And in some of that WA rangelands, and in some of the rangelands in Western New South Wales and Western Queensland, we've actually got an excess protein and not enough energy. So where you've got, things like mulga and so on, and other edible trees, tend to end up with a lot more protein than you've got energy, and the thing that's lacking in those systems then is grass or roughage. All right. Just a couple of things. Water medication, I won't go into it, but it is also a very cost-effective way to feed some of your minerals in your growing season and/or your protein in your non-growing season or in your dry seasons. And they can be mobile or they can be fixed. The protein story, we haven't really got time to go into degradable and non-degradable at the moment. I guess the last principle really, and I won't go into minerals now, is we talk about free choice minerals, free choice supplements, so that's what this system is. And you can see the animals just coming in and using this stuff. But probably the one I want to finish off on is making sure that what you're doing is economic. And so what we've got in the nutrition course, for example, is this feed curve calculator where we can work out what I call nutritional seasons. And so whether you're in the tropics or whether you're in a temperate sort of zone, you can build your own feed curve in both quantity and quality, and then break that up into what I call nutritional seasons. So a nutritional season is a season that you're going to get every year. You don't actually know when you're going to get it or how long it is, but you know you're going to get it. And then some of these seasons require where you can benefit from supplementation, and other seasons there's no point in trying to feed them anything. So if I just use this example here, here we've got plenty of quantity, but rapidly declining quality. So that season there might be one in which we would really look at a supplement of some sort, particularly a protein supplement, to use that dry feed and keep animals in better condition, et cetera, et cetera. So that breaking it up into seasons, looking at what you would feed in each season is probably the best way to really get to the bottom of economics. So just to finish off, the economic goals, I think, need to come first. You're in business, and anything that you put down the animal's neck has got to give you a return. Accurate diagnosis, I think, comes after your economic goals. You need to plan a nutritional program based on what I call the nutritional seasons. Monitor your costs and production. So if you're starting to feed anything, then know what the animals weighed when you started, know what they are a month or 6 weeks later, and try and monitor that, and then match up the production with the costs and make sure that the benefit far exceeds the costs. Get on and do something about it. So, Joe, I think I'll pull up there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Terry. I really appreciate this information. It's a lot to get through in the hour we gave, and the questions have been really important. I know that there's a really good questions there that others in the room are probably thinking about. So thank you for those who asked the questions. What I'd like to do before we exit this webinar is, because it is a soils and landscapes project, I'd like to just introduce Megan. Thank you for bringing onto the screen 4 questions for your feedback. If we can hold these sorts of things in the future, we like to understand whether it was worthwhile for you. So if you could go ahead and answer each of the 4 questions, what you'll do is on screen see the 4 questions, fill them all out, and at the end, I believe you'll have a submit button, and that will send us your answers. So I really do, while you're filling this out, I really do appreciate your time today. And thank you for your input and your interactions. I really do hope you got plenty out of today. Terry is a wealth of knowledge, and it's always a privilege to have him on the call, and a very big privilege to have you guys involved with this webinar. So thank you very much, and I wish you a very good Wednesday evening.